Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Israel Unplugged. This is Josh Wander from Yerushalayim, Yer HaKodesh, and you are listening to Israel Unplugged, where you get the unadulterated facts of where we're holding in the redemptive process, focusing primarily on the ingathering of the exiles. This is a live show. We encourage you to call in. If you happen to be stuck in North America, I would ask you to call the U.S. number, which is 301-768-4841. That's 301-768-4841. And if you're fortunate enough to be here in the Holy Land, then the number would be 02-650-0151, 02-650-0151. Today, we are dedicating this program to someone who I would comfortably say is the father of modern religious Zionism. His name was Rabbi Yahrtzeit of HaKohein Kook, and his Yahrtzeit, his anniversary of his death was Gimel Elul, was this past week, and we're fortunate enough again to be with my co-host Rabbi Moshe Lichtman from Beit Shemesh, who is an expert on this person. He's written a biography
Translated a biography on Rav Kook, written by Simcha Raz, also famous for his biography on Rav Aryeh Levine. But yeah, I translated the one on Rav Kook. Yes.
So we are going to be dedicating this to Rabbi Kook. He was an amazing character that his influence is felt today across the Torah observant world, especially here in Israel, but around the world. And we are so fortunate to be with someone who can speak in depth about this amazing character. I want to also recommend that you go to the websites of Rabbi Lichtman, toratzion.com, and our website, itstimetolive.com. Both of those websites have an enormous amount of information to educate and inform Jews around the world of the importance of living here in the land of Israel today. Please stay with us, where you're going to have an amazing show. And like I said, if you have any questions, any comments, we welcome you to call in. This is a live show, so please call in with your questions and your comments. We will be right back.
Israel is located in one of the most volatile areas in the world. Israel is an island of stability in a sea of war and unrest. In the midst of this turmoil, Israel stands out as a beacon of order and human progress. Each week we update you on what's happening in this, the Jewish state, a true light unto the nations. This is Jay Shapiro. Join me every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Israel Unplugged. As we said in the introduction, we will be dedicating this show, or at least most of it, to the memory of one of the greatest rabbis of the modern era, and that is Rav Yahrtzeit of HaKohein Kook. Before I get into it, we're mainly going to discuss his philosophy vis-a-vis the land of Israel and the modern return to Israel. But I just want to make sure that people understand who we're talking about. We're not just talking about excuse the phrase, run-of-the-mill rabbi. We're talking about literally one of the greatest rabbis. I don't want to say, who ever lived, probably yes, but, certainly of the last few centuries. Just as for an example, Rav Kook was so brilliant already at a very, very young age. He studied in the famed Volozhin Yeshiva which had really the greatest minds of Europe at the time in the late 1800s. And he nonetheless still stood out amongst all of the greats of that time. For example, when he only learned there for about a year and a half, and he studied, his daily study was 60 blot of Gemara a day, which means 60 folio pages of Talmud a day, with all of the in-depth explanations of all of the Rishonim, the earlier commentators. He was simply brilliant. And one of the great Roshei Yeshiva, the heads of the yeshiva, was the Netziv of Volozhin. We've definitely mentioned him before on the show. Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was clearly one of the greats of the generation. And there's this amazing story that after Rav Kook had already left the yeshiva and got married, he came back for a visit to the yeshiva, and it happened to have been during the 9 days. The 9 days are the days of mourning between right before Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, and the minhag, the custom or the halacha, is that we're not allowed to eat meat or drink wine. The Netziv of Volozhin, however, ordered, this is the Rosh Yeshiva, he ordered that when Rav Kook came back to visit, this 20-something-year-old student, he came back to visit, he ordered the cooks or whoever it was to prepare a full festive meal with meat and wine. And of course they asked, but Rabbi, it's the 9 days, we can't have meat and wine. And he said, a meal in the honor of Rav Kook is a meal for the honor of Torah, and you are allowed to have meat and wine during the 9 days. This was when Rav Kook was in his 20s. In fact, the Netziv of Volozhin once commented that if the entire yeshiva of Volozhin, which stood for, I don't know exactly how many years, but at least 100 years, then it was again one of the greatest yeshivot of all time. If it was only created in order to produce one person like Rav Kook, it was worth it.
I just want to interject that many people mistakenly think of Volozhin, which is the yeshiva that started all yeshivas. The yeshiva system that we have today was started in the yeshiva in Volozhin. And many people think that this was an anti-Zionist yeshiva, and the exact opposite is true. In fact, they had an underground organization, club, that was known as Netzach Yisrael, and that underground organization was to promote Zionism, was to promote the return to Eretz Yisrael, of the Jews to Eretz Yisrael. And it almost lasted as long as the yeshiva. The yeshiva closed down in, I think, 1892, and it lasted for a very long time until it was closed down because it was so controversial. Why was it so controversial? Not because it was pro-Zionism, but because the Russian authorities thought that it was revolutionary.
Correct. So another example, just to understand who we're talking about, probably one of the greatest poskim, the halachic deciders of the time, was Rav Chaim Ozer Grodzensky in Poland, and supposedly Rav Isser Zalmer Meltzer, who was very close with Rav Kook, was also very well known, very well accepted throughout the Haredi and throughout the Torah world, once commented to Rav Chaim Ozer Grodzensky. He said, "We are all gedolim until we're all great rabbis until we reach Rav Kook's doorstep. None of us," and he said this to the undisputed Gadol Hador of Chaim Ozer. He said, "We're all gedolim until we reach Rav Kook's doorstep," because there was no one even close. And I'll maybe just give one more quick story. There was a groundbreaking ceremony for yeshiva in Bnei Brak, and the Chazon Ish, who, by the way, Rav Kook had helped get to Israel to begin with, because Rav Kook was the chief rabbi of Palestine, of the mandatory Palestine, and he had the ability to help great rabbis and Talmidei Chachamim, Torah scholars, come to Israel. So he helped the Chazon Ish come. So there was one time there was a groundbreaking ceremony, And Rav Kook was one of the speakers, and it was, as I said, it was in Bnei Brak, so the Chazon Ish was also there. And so everyone stood up when Rav Kook came, when Rav Kook entered, and then Rav Kook started to speak, and of course everyone sat down, everyone except for the Chazon Ish. And somebody said to him, Rabbi, you don't have to stand the whole time. Why are you continuing to stand? And he said, when Rav Kook is standing, it's like a Sefer Torah standing. And when a Sefer Torah, when a Torah scroll is standing, is moving, is not in the ark, you're not allowed to sit down. You have to continue standing. That's how he viewed Rav Kook. That doesn't mean that everyone agreed with his philosophy, and I think it's mainly because people didn't really understand the depths of his philosophy. But there is no doubt that we are talking about a extremely, extremely great rabbi, knowledgeable, and also righteous. We won't even get into how righteous he was. Besides the depths of his knowledge, there's so many chapters in my book about his tzidkut, his righteous actions towards other people. But I want to focus on his love for Zion. You see, he became the chief rabbi of Israel, or the head rabbi, first of the settlements in Israel, when he moved to Jaffa in, I think, around 1920. So there are many, many stories which are really indicative of his love for the land of Israel. For example,
can I just interrupt, because people may not understand when you use that word settlements. We're talking pre-state right now, because Rabbi Kook died, I believe, in 1935, if I'm not mistaken.
1935, correct.
So this is before 1948. This is before there were any settlements that people refer to today, which are post-1948, post-1967. This is just the name of Jewish settlers, people that are settling the land of Israel.
Right. I mean, to tell you the truth, every single city in Israel is a settlement. Those our enemies who claim that we're said the settlements are illegal, etc. They want to get us out of even Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa and every other place, because to them it's all settlements. But just an example of his love for the land of Israel. He during I think it was in 1914, right? He was he was in right when World War I broke out. Rav Kook was stuck, so to say, in Europe. He had gone for a convention, and then the war broke out. The convention was canceled, but people couldn't leave. So at one point, he was very depressed that he couldn't go back to Israel, where he had already lived several years. And so during that time, Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who was known as the help me here, Josh. He is the Sridei Eish.
He was a Sridei Eish. He was from Slonim, no?
I don't know where. I think it was in Germany. Someone says something in Germany. Anyway, so he said the following story. Once the Rav visited my apartment in Berlin. There you go. I don't know, he might have been from Slonim, but he was in Berlin. And hoping to please him in some way, I took him over to a window which had a breathtaking view of the city of Berlin. He was unimpressed by the view, however. Instead, he burst into tears and whispered the words, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and also wept as we remembered Zion." He constantly had his mind on Zion, on Israel. And when he was forced to be outside the land of Israel, it was very difficult for him. Another similar story is also during that time period when he was there during World War I. He was again very depressed, especially by the news of how difficult things were for the Jews who were in Palestine at the time. So some of his close associates wanted to sort of take his mind off of it, so they decided to take him on a trip to the Alps. So after driving by car for
I think you broke up there. I didn't hear you. They took a trip to the Alps?
To the Alps, yes. Do you hear me now? Yeah.
Now I hear you.
Okay. So after traveling for some time, they stopped at a place with a magnificent view of the mountains. The Rav, however, was lost in thought and did not pay much attention to the view. So the one who was with him, his name was Rav Zalman. Rav Zalman tried to snap him out of it, saying, "Rabbi, look how beautiful the mountains are." The Rav Kook, lifted his eyes and said, as if just awakened, "Yes, yes, Jerusalem, mountains surround it." We just wish that Jews today who are in, foreign lands would at least once in a while think about the land of Israel, Here,
we have to finish off this segment.
Yes, we're going on a break. Correct. We're going on a break. We'll continue this right after.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Tamar? She's sassy.
She's smart.
She's funny.
But she's also a real Jewish mother.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tamar Yona. And yes, I can be all of those things, but at Israel News Talk Radio, I'm here to bring you the news stories and guests that you may not hear anywhere else. Join me live on air Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays for the most unique and bold talk radio in Israel.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Shalom, I'm Leah Aharoni. Join me on my show, News from the Torah. Each Sunday, we'll use the weekly Torah portion as a prism for understanding the news today. Listen to News from the Torah to gain clarity about the times we're living in and to understand your own spiritual path in the process. News from the Torah every Sunday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Israel Unplugged. We were telling stories about Rav Kook, specifically when he was outside of the land of Israel. Just tell one more. Rav Kook also, besides being stuck in Europe during World War I, he also, at least once, maybe more than once, went on a trip to the United States for funding, to find funding for his yeshiva and for other religious institutions in Israel. So while he was there, people cared for his every need. But once they came to visit the Rav Kook, and they found him in a very somber mood. So they said to him, "Are you missing anything? Is there something we can get for you?" So Rav Kook responded with a parable. He said there was once a king who decided to take a pleasure cruise on the high seas. His servants loaded the ship with all the elegant dishes and cutlery that the king was accustomed to at home. And every day they prepared him sumptuous meals. And they even arranged for musicians to play beautiful music while he dined. But one day, the royal ministers noticed that the king looked gloomy. So they said, "What is wrong? Is there anything missing on the royal vessel?" "No," answered the king. "I am not lacking anything except for dry land." In other words, he was getting seasick. Same goes for me, concluded Rav Kook. Thank God I am lacking nothing except for dry land, the land of Israel. Again, his mind, he was always in Israel. His mind was constantly on the land of Israel. He missed it every time he had to leave. Again, something that we certainly can learn from him.
Now, what made him so controversial and misunderstood, I think, was two things. First of all, he wrote his books in a very, very high Hebrew, a very poetic Hebrew, which is hard to understand. If you're not used to his terminologies, his lexicon, it's very difficult for someone to just pick up his book and understand what he means when he's writing.
Right.
And the second thing,
before you go on, one second.
Go ahead.
I just want to make a point that it's not because he decided to write that way. He was such a poetic soul that's just the way his writing would come out, would flow out from his soul. He sometimes would just sit there and write, and whatever came out, and that's the way it came out because he was on such a high level. Yeah, I'm sorry. So
and I understand that there's a lot of writings of his that have yet to be published and are still kept in secret somewhere. This is at least the rumor. Yes. Because his son was Rav Tzvi Yehuda, who took over after he passed away, thought it was too controversial and too radical to be printed. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that he had such a love for his fellow Jew that often he embraced many secular Jews, even anti-Torah Jews, people that were rejected by the rest of the Orthodox Torah world. And he embraced them. He said that they were doing a wonderful thing being here in the land of Israel and rebuilding the land of Israel. And he saw them for only the positive, and he did not say anything negative about these people. And that made him into quite a controversial figure at the time.
Correct. But there are places where he writes very clearly that it shouldn't be misunderstood as if he is condoning their actions and saying that, we should emulate their rebellion against Torah. Of course not. There was no one more exacting in his service of Hashem than Rav Kook. Of course not. But he meant to say is that, unfortunately, this is the situation right now. There's plenty of Jews who have left the fold, but the ones who are here in Israel and building up the land, we have to look at the positive. We have to look at what they are doing, and he, of course, he had a very, very deep and Kabbalistic understanding of why that was happening specifically in our times. And you're right, he was beyond his time. He was ahead of his time, I should say. In other words, people just couldn't understand them. In fact, since you mention it, there's this one story that I love. They, not only was he controversial, people in the extremist Haredi camp did some very terrible things to him, cursing him, throwing sewage water on him, obviously bashing him in every possible way, in every medium that they could. And it was very sad. So there was one time, we're talking about, this is the week after his Yahrtzeit, the anniversary of his death. So one time a bunch of Merkaz Harav students, I can't find the story right now, so I won't be able to give it the exact quote, but you'll get the idea. So some of the students of Merkaz Harav went to the Kotel, I'm pretty sure. We're at the Kotel on this 3rd of Elul. And all of a sudden, a man dressed clearly in very Haredi apparel came over to them, got on his knees, and started to cry. And they didn't know what was going on. What's wrong with this man? And when he finally got himself together, he said, I was taught when I was a young child to curse the name of and to disparage the great rabbi whose Yahrtzeit is today. And I feel such remorse for the terrible sin that I did, cursing out such a great rabbi, but I am a Kohen. And I can't go to his grave. And the halacha is that if one does something bad to somebody and that person dies, so they have to go to the grave in order to ask forgiveness. So he said, I can't do that because I'm a Kohen. I can't go to his grave. So I beg of you, please somehow get me, atonement, accept my regret and my remorse for the terrible sin I did. And, they didn't know what to do, but they said, you are forgiven. And they lifted him off the ground and, and he went away and he felt better. So, unfortunately, there are so many people who were just taught that and they didn't know the greatness of Rav Kook. They didn't understand how deep he was, how towering his greatness was. Another story. Again, when Rav Kook was in the United States, he got into a conversation with a wealthy Jew. And realizing the man was well-to-do, the Rav tried to persuade him to immigrate to the land of Israel. It's not like you have any excuse, like you can't do it. You can do it. You can take your money and you can build a beautiful house here in Israel. After giving various reasons why he could not make Aliyah just yet, the man said, God willing, though, I will move there in the near future. To this, the Rav retorted, God certainly wills it, for dwelling in the land of Israel is one of his commandments. The only question is, do you want it as well? Everyone always says, God willing, Bezrat Hashem, right? With God's help, or Im Yirtzeh Hashem. That's really the translation of God willing. Im Yirtzeh Hashem, right? If God wants it. What do you mean if God wants it? Of course God wants it. It's a mitzvah in the Torah to live in Israel. You just have to want it. And that's a real important message for our fellow Jews out there. But I want to end this segment, I hope we have enough time, with a very, very powerful story. You see, after World War II, so we know that the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, and many Polish Jews fled to Russia during that time to escape the Nazis. But after the war, so then Russia became communist Russia and wouldn't let these Jews leave, and they were persecuting the Jews more in a spiritual sense, not allowing them to keep Torah and mitzvot. So there was this agreement, this treaty made with Poland and the USSR, allowing anybody who could prove that they were a citizen of Poland in 1939 when the war broke out, that they are allowed to come back to Poland from the USSR. And of course, these Jews would not stay in Poland. This was after World War II. There was nothing to stay for. But they used it as a stepping stone to be able to then leave Europe, and many of them came to Israel. So the Jewish Agency actually set up shop there in Poland, in Warsaw, and received all these Jews who were coming out of Russia to Poland and then moving to Israel. So one of the heads of the Jewish Agency, Reb Baruch Duvdevani, was there. That was his job during that time, and he tells the following really, really scary story, or a very powerful story. One December morning, when the temperature in Warsaw was 19 degrees below 0 Celsius, he arrived at the Israeli assembly where they were stationed for their work, and the courtyard was filled with people who wanted, to discuss, Aliyah issues. And Baruch Duvdevani describes how he noticed an old Jew standing in the corner of the courtyard. He was bone thin with practically no flesh on his body. His dim eyes lacked any spark of life. His cheekbones protruded profusely, and his clothes were tattered and torn despite the bitter cold. So after he finished speaking to all the other people, Baruch Duvdevani walked over to this man, and he said, "Is there anything I can help you with?" And the man said, "Are you from Jerusalem?" And he said, "Yeah. I actually am from Jerusalem." So he said, "Did you know Rav Kook? Did you know Rav Kook?" And Baruch Duvdevani said, "Yes, I actually did. I learned in his yeshiva, and I heard shiurim from him." At that point, the old man, broke down and crying and saying, what a shame that I did not listen to him. So I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger over here, because what does that mean that he didn't listen to Rav Kook? And what exactly was the story? We'll find out right after the break. Stay with us. Don't go anywhere, because this is an amazing, amazing story.
In a time where feelings have become fact, where rational thought and common sense has disappeared, one man stands above it all.
I'm Howie Sobiker, your political hitman.
Political Hitman airs every Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. North American time, 7 a.m. Israeli time, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Okay, we're back. Israel Unplugged, and I'm sure you are waiting at the edge of your seat to hear the end of this story. So Rav Kook, so this man who just escaped the USSR, came to Poland. He tells Baruch Duvdevani, he says, what a shame that I didn't listen to Rav Kook. And he then continued to sob for a while. When he finally calmed down, he told his story. In the early 1920s, he says, I was a manufacturer in one of Poland's famous industrial cities. One day, I decided to take a trip to the land of Israel and spend Pesach there, the Passover holiday there. And he was a religious Jew. So therefore, when he came, he immediately visited Rav Kook. He welcomed me warmly and encouraged me to seek out the good of the land and consider settling there. See, Rav Kook was not afraid. If a Jew came to Israel from somewhere else, he would say, why don't you look into the possibility of living in Israel? After a few weeks of touring, he says, I returned to Rav Kook and I asked him, among other things, what I should do regarding the second day of Yom Tov, right? Should I keep a second day of Yom Tov? Because I'm a tourist. And, that's a famous question, whether you keep 2 days of Yom Tov or not. The Rav answered with a smile, decide right now to bring your family here and to build a factory in the land of Israel. Then you can keep 1 day of Yom Tov already this Pesach, like all the inhabitants of Eretz Yisrael. The man said, I took his answer jovially, and since the holiday was still a few weeks away, I decided to return at a later date and pose the question again. So a few days before Pesach, I went to the Rav and I asked him the question once again. This time, Rav Kook answered sternly, I already told you that you should move here. Then you may keep 1 day of Yom Tov, of the holiday, starting right now, even if you must return to Poland after Pesach to settle your affairs. I said, excuse me, dear Rabbi, I have thought about it at great length, but in the end, my intention, my dot, literally the word dot means knowledge, but it means my intention is to return to the diaspora. How then can I celebrate like the residents of Eretz Yisrael? The Rav banged his hand on the table and said with great emotion, your dot is to return? Your intention is to return? That is nothing but lack of dot, lack of sense. That makes no sense. And now the man continues. I did not listen to the Rav. I returned to the diaspora and remained there. I lost my wife, my children, and my grandchildren in the Holocaust. And here I am today, lonely and desolate. I have come back here with nothing after wandering for years throughout Russia. And I constantly recall Rav Kook's prophetic words. That is nothing but lack of dot, lack of sense. Josh, what do you think the message is for today's Jews?
Well, the message is clear. The message is, you know what? The message that people keep asking me, why are the gates of Israel closed today to Jewish tourists that want to come here? They want to come here for the holidays. They want to come here to visit. They want to come here, as they always do, to recharge their spiritual batteries. And I think, in my humble opinion, that the message is very clear. Hashem, God doesn't want us to return here as visitors. He doesn't want us to come here like we go to visit Cancun or we go to visit somewhere in Europe. Disneyland. We are meant to come to Israel in order to live here, to reside here. This is our place. This is our home that we're supposed to be. And if you come here and you understand that this is your home, then our arms are open to you and you are welcome to come on Aliyah at any point. We're not stopping Aliyah. We're just the doors are pretty much closed for visitors. So if you treat Israel as a visitor, then you shouldn't be here. And if you treat Israel as your home, you are always welcome.
Right. And what the story tells us is we never know when the gates will totally close and when a decision to stay in the diaspora might be a very, very costly decision. Continuing. Rav Kook was once on his way to Tel Aviv with some escorts when the car in which they were riding developed engine trouble. Now, it wasn't like today, you just call it AAA. They were forced to pull over and stop for a while somebody tried to, fix the car. So in the meantime, all the passengers dispersed in different directions to find something to do to pass the time. And the Rav also disappeared. after a while, the Rav's escorts decided to search for him. They found him a short distance away, completely outstretched on the ground, whispering the words, my land, O holy soil of Eretz Yisrael." When he rose to his feet, he said to the people who had gathered around him, and can you imagine? And a normal person would be like, oops, you think I'm crazy, I know. He didn't say that. He said, "When else do I have an opportunity to chat with our motherland, who longs for her children to return to her borders?" He viewed Eretz Yisrael as like a mother, like a living creature, like a living being. And he had such a love for Eretz Yisrael that he could get down on his knees and lie flat on the ground just to show his love for this beautiful land.
That's what the Talmud says, that the rabbis used to roll in the dust of Israel, as the verse says, "Ki ratzu avadecha es avonecha ves afara ichonenu." So that's the tradition, the Jewish tradition.
Correct.
And people to this day, by the way, for those that are listeners that don't know, many people that come to Israel, they come on Aliyah and they get off the plane. And when they step off the plane in Israel, I don't think there's any other country like this in the world, they bow down to the ground and they kiss the ground that they're coming on. So this is a very special place. Yeah. Last story. Can we make one other? Get one last one in.
I hope we can make one more story. This is a very, very powerful one. Under the influence of Rav Kook, an American Jew came to the land of Israel with the intention of settling there permanently. One day, however, he showed up at the Rav's house and requested a farewell blessing. For some reason, he had decided to return to America. We mentioned before, how Rav Kook viewed the pioneer settlers of the land of Israel, even though they were religious. So this story is really going to show his philosophy on that. So Rav Kook said to the man, "Why are you leaving so suddenly?" So the man replied, "I am sick of life here in the land of Israel. I cannot stand the Sabbath desecration and overall disdain for our religion that is so rampant among the pioneer settlers of the land. Therefore, I have decided to leave the country and return to America." These words, coming from the mouth of a simple, well-meaning Jew, giving voice to the yearnings of his soul, agitated and shook the Rav's heartstrings, but he contained himself. With a grin on his face, he turned to his guest and asked where he lived in America. "My home is in Denver, Colorado," replied the American Jew. Then, with a distinctive patriotism, he began describing the beauty of the city with its overlooking mountains and remarkably crisp and pleasant air. "There are no narrow, filthy alleyways," he added mockingly, "like here in Jerusalem. There the streets are broad, the houses large and elegant, and trolley cars speed through the streets of the city." Then he went on to speak as if spellbound about the beautiful nature that surrounds Denver. So after a while, the Rav Kook, interrupted the man and said, "If I'm not mistaken, Denver has a lot of tuberculosis sufferers. A man from Jerusalem recently returned from a trip to America and told me that when he was in Denver, he met many people with incurable chronic diseases. If what you are saying is true, that Denver's climate is so healthy and invigorating, why are there so many sick people there?" So the man replied, "Does Your Honor really think that these sick people are natives of Denver? They all come from other cities where fresh air and sunshine are sorely lacking. They contracted this terrible disease, tuberculosis, in their hometowns and then came to Denver on doctor's orders to benefit from its fresh air and hopefully recover. Of course, some people come with a very advanced form of the disease. They neglected their condition for a long time and came too late. Their lungs are so full of bacteria and there is almost no hope of recovery. That man from Jerusalem must have met some of those people in the streets of Denver, and he mistakenly thought that the city was to blame for their miserable condition. That naive man didn't realize that this city with its healing air actually brings relief and rehabilitation to thousands of desperately ill patients from all around the world. Rav Kook interrupted the flow of the man's words and replied in a calm and gentle manner. Think about what you are saying. The air of our holy land is also special. It makes one wise and has the ability to heal. Hapless Jews have come and continue to come to Eretz Yisrael from all over the world, where the foreign atmosphere of the lands of exile had a detrimental effect on their spirits, poisoning their souls. These Jews were on the verge of assimilating, God forbid, into the Gentile culture and dying a spiritual death on foreign soil. Fortunately, though, the healer of the Jewish people provided the cure before the ailment and infused them with a breath of life, inspiring them to love and yearn for Eretz Yisrael. They come to this therapeutic environment to breathe in some fresh air and spirit. If you see so many afflicted souls here in the Holy Land, realize that they were born elsewhere. Had they not come here as soon as they did, they would have been in danger of assimilation. They are seriously ill, but we must treat them when they come here, just like they treat the tuberculosis patients in Denver. I firmly believe that the atmosphere of Eretz Yisrael will have a positive, blessed influence on many of them, bringing them both physical and spiritual health. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Be back with us next week, where we will talk again about the importance of living in Israel and the times in which we are living.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
Howdy, this is Rita from League City, Texas, now living in Israel. And though my heart may have belonged to Texas, it now belongs to Israel and all the fantastic show hosts at Israel News Talk Radio.
Hi, this is Michael Solomon from Kiryat Arba, Israel. And why do I love listening to Israel News Talk Radio? Because I love listening to the interesting interviews they do and their news reporting that most other media sources don't cover.
Hey, this is Nicoleko from Malmö, Sweden. It gets pretty cold here in Sweden, so I love cuddling up with a warm cup of tea while I listen to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey everybody, this is Frank Morris from Tennessee. Me and my dog Buster really love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.